Well, hello and welcome to Hidden History, Stories from the Secret City. And I'm Ray Smith, and I'm just really glad to have a couple of individuals with us today that has a connection to Kenneth Nichols. We've got Dave Nichols, who is his son, and we've got Barbara Scollin, who is Kenneth Nichols' niece. And I do want to start out by saying how much I appreciate Barbara for how she helped to finance some efforts at the Friends of the Oak Ridge Library, Public Library, to help us get a handle on artifacts. She came to Oak Ridge and started asking people about things to do with her uncle, Kenneth Nichols, and we did not do well. We didn't show her what she would like to see, a good collection of the whatever we might have, and we do have some things, and she helped us with that. But she also helped us to pull together several historians and archivists, and we're now working closer as a group to try and prevent people who have artifacts from the Manhattan Project that might be passing it down through multiple generations. And usually the second generation don't really understand the significance of what they might have. So, Barbara, well, I really appreciate you helping us do that. And
Thank
Dave,
you.
I believe you've been to Oak Ridge at least a time or two, Dave. Is that correct?
We were back there about 6, 7 years ago with our grandson, and you were generous enough to give us some of your time and historical background, and it was a lovely visit for him and for us as well.
Yeah, I remember that and thoroughly enjoyed being able to show you around town. Well, Barbara, you have some photographs that you want to talk about, and we'll put those up if you want to go ahead and do that part of our session together.
Sounds good.
All right, let me get it up now. All right, there's the first one.
This is a photograph that was taken in West Park, Cleveland, where Uncle Ken was born. The man standing with the water hose is his father, okay. Dave's grandfather, Wilbur Nichols. Over to the left by the wheel is Uncle Ken's older brother, Lauren. And to his right, kind of crouched down, is my grandfather, John. Those were his two older brothers. He also had an older sister, Mildred. His father was a successful contractor and built many homes in the Cleveland area. And he also served as mayor of West Park for 10 years. Kenneth, at a very early age, started working. He delivered newspapers at the age of 6. He mowed lawns, and he worked in a grocery store. But his favorite pastime was riding in a horse-drawn carriage with his father, inspecting the houses that were being built. And he loved watching the carpenters, the bricklayers, and his father in charge of all of it. This picture is taken in the front yard of their home on Rocky River Drive. It's still there. Literally across the street is the Congregational Church that his father built, and it is still in operation. A wonderful congregation there. Kenneth was born in 1907, so he was young enough to see gas, then electricity and running water added to his home. And he had a very happy childhood. He got along well with his siblings and was a very great son. Practically everybody in the neighborhood was related by either birth or marriage. He had over 50 first cousins. And every Labor Day weekend, there was a huge family reunion on his mother's side. When Aunt Jackie first went, she couldn't believe what was going on. All these people was like an army. and all the food in long, long tables. His mother, Minnie Mae Colburn, was the glue of the family, and she was a very loving person. My mother had many fond memories of her. And she was the one that urged her youngest son, Kenneth, to go and apply to go to West Point. She saw a movie called Classmates, and that did the trick. There was only his grandfather that had been in the Civil War and an uncle in the military, so he did not know much about the military. So his first devotion was to family. Number one was family. When he married Jackie, her maiden name was Durlot, if I'm pronouncing that correct, David. They were married 67 years.
Wow.
And he just adored her.
I'll help you with the French, Barbara. It's Derry-la, and she spent her last 12 years with our family, living in our home in Washington, and was a devout Roman Catholic to the day she passed, and would always go to mass, and just was a wonderful role model as far as an individual having a faith. She spoke broken English, so I learned to speak broken French back to her. And she just really, it was a treat to have her. Jan and I just loved her to death. Grand-mère.
You're speaking of your grandmother?
Yes, grand-mère.
And your grandfather taught swordsmanship at West Point?
He was a fencer. Was a head coach for a couple of Olympic fencing teams, and also at Cornell he was the fencing professor, if you will. And yeah, he was quite the guy with the sword.
All right, that's a good history of the ancestry. You ready to go to the next one?
Well, I thought I'd give you a little background before World War II.
Right.
Uncle Ken went to West Point. He was the youngest cadet to go to West Point, and he loved everything about West Point. He graduated in 1929. He was number 1 in his class of engineering. He was number 5 in the overall class. And because of his high ranking, he got to choose which branch of the Army he could go in. And he chose the Army Corps of Engineers. He was faithful to the Army Corps, and to the day he died, he was devoted to West Point. In 1929, after he graduated, his first assignment was down in Nicaragua, surveying one of the 3 routes that would be used for the Panama Canal. And that place, more than any, taught him how to be a leader of men. The writings that he had of all of that was edited out of his book, The Road to Trinity, but I have his original manuscript of from birth up to World War II, and it has quite a few fun stories. He handled a court-martial of a drunken soldier. He learned how to listen to all those that were subordinate. He learned how to keep his men supplied and keep their morale up. In Nicaragua is the place that he first met First Lieutenant Leslie Groves, which he would later work with.
Right.
And he was assigned to run the supply lines at San Carlos, where he wrote the following. I found out that Groves tried to get more than his fair share of fresh fruit and produce, which I procured at San Carlos, and was supposed to allot equally to each company down the river. I told Sergeant Jackson to refuse to give Groves more than his quota. At the same time, friction also developed between our non-commissioned officers when Groves borrowed a boat for hydrographic survey. Sergeant Smith kept our boats, including the bilge, absolutely spotless. Yet, when another boat was returned dirty, Smith forced Groves' sergeant to scrub it out. I was apprehensive about Groves' reaction, but apparently he had reviewed the incident and only said, "Nichols, I hear you're taking good care of my men and furthering their training when they work with you."
How about that? So their relationship goes back to a good bit before the Manhattan Project. So they did know
That's
one
right.
another. Yeah.
All the way back to 1929. The jungle experience was quite a challenge. They dealt with constant rain, mud, alligators, snakes, red ants. In Ochoa, he wrote, "The cook's pet ocelot," which is a big cat, would crawl under the mosquito bar and curl up beside me on my cot at night. And the heat was so oppressive that he lost most of his hair. So he was down there for 3 years. There was no returning back to Ohio to visit the family. So I've been reading through his letters back to his family. He was a devoted son and wrote monthly. One of the letters I think you might find interesting. He said, "I just took time out to doctor up one of my men. He had a slight fever, probably malaria. So he's now sweating it out as a result of prescribing 24 grains of quinine and a mug of hot water containing 2 whiskey glasses of Johnny Walker and 2 of Bacardi rum. I'm expecting an increase of patients when the news of my treatment leaks out."
That's enough whiskey in there to make them drunk, whether they were being cured or not. They felt better.
That's right. So in 1931, there was a huge earthquake that consumed most of the capital's center, the business center, and all of the water supply was cut off. The Army Corps was called in within hours, and Uncle Ken was involved with fighting the fires that were consuming all of downtown. He was awarded the Nicaraguan Medal of Merit for that. After he leaves Panama in 1931, he gets a bachelor's degree at Cornell. In 1932, he's the director of waterways in Vicksburg, Maryland. In 1932, he's at Cornell and he meets Jackie and they get married. In 1933, he gets a master's degree in engineering. Then the Army wants him to study hydraulics. The War Department sends him to Germany, so he learns German and he studies hydraulics. He writes out his doctoral thesis on hydraulics, but then the war starts heating up. So he's pulled back to the United States. He gets his PhD finally at the University of Iowa in experimental hydraulics. Then in 1937, for 4 years, he goes back to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and he teaches the Department of Civil and Military Engineering. In 1942, Colonel James Marshall assigns him to build the Rome, New York Air Depot. And he does a very good job at that, and people start to take notice of him. In 41, of course, we're drawn into the war, but he's working simultaneously on the air depot. And then in 42, Colonel James Marshall assigns him to construct a TNT plant at the Pennsylvania Ordnance Works in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. His father dies in 42, so his father never sees everything that he achieved in his career. In 42, he is chosen by the Army's Chief of Engineer with Colonel James Marshall, not to be confused with George Marshall, to direct all the construction to be used in making the atomic bomb. President Roosevelt assigned Lieutenant Nichols to what would be known as the Manhattan Engineering District, or the MED. In June of 42, Nichols meets with Marshall, who is at that point the district engineer, and he's given 15 seconds to volunteer for a secret mission.
15.
15 seconds, you can volunteer. He agrees, he volunteers. He becomes the third government employee to sign on. So Colonel Marshall is the first employee. Virginia Olson is the second, who is Colonel Marshall's secretary. She then later is assigned to General Groves, and finally to Colonel Nichols. She will stay with him the rest of his career, both in the military and in private practice. She devoted her entire life to service for our country and was treated as family.
Okay, that's good. That's neat.
So if you would go to the next picture.
Okay.
This is the chain of command in the military as of 1945 for the Manhattan Project. At the top, of course, is President Franklin Roosevelt. Later, it would become Harry Truman. Secretary of War, Harry Stimson. Chief of Staff, George Marshall. Major General Groves reports to Marshall directly, and once in a while to Harry Stimson. Directly under Groves is Colonel Nichols. He is in charge of all of the Clinton Engineering Works that we now know as Oak Ridge, the Hanford Engineer Works in Hanford, Washington, Los Alamos for all the administration, as well as 10 offices. The early start of the Manhattan Project was handled by Colonel Marshall. They worked together on the very big issues: the funding of the project, the administration, the prioritization of work, procuring materials, site surveys, and the location of the headquarters. They kept the name Manhattan to deflect any mention of where the actual work would be done. They also met with Vannevar Bush, James Conant, and the S1 committee, looking at various sites around the country, including the choice of Oak Ridge. He first went to Oak Ridge on July 2nd, 1942. Colonel Nichols met with Arthur Compton at the metallurgical lab at the University of Chicago, and he saw the overcrowding there. So on his own initiative, he established a new experimental site in the Argonne Forest, what would be the Argonne National Forest. And he met with the S1 committee at the Bohemian Grove, which was a pretty prestigious place. And he thought he was going to learn what was going on. Instead, everyone wanted to talk to him. And Jackie said he was the man of the hour, and the entire weekend was full of him relaying his information on what was going on. Marshall gave Colonel Leslie Groves the draft of a general order that formed the Manhattan Engineering District, And Marshall also laid the groundwork for the AAA priority that the MED would receive. Groves took the football and ran it to the end post. He worked with the president and Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, to get that final priority, which was so critical. Marshall served as the original district engineer with Colonel Nichols as the deputy district engineer. And after Marshall was reassigned, Nichols was named the district engineer. And then Groves comes into the picture. Nichols was headquartered in Oak Ridge, and his office became known as the Castle. So if you look at the next photo.
But before you leave that, let me ask you to be sure that I have it correct. You indicated that Colonel Nichols was in the area that became Oak Ridge as early as June of 42. Is that what you said?
July 2nd of 42.
Okay. What do you know about that visit?
He and Colonel Marshall looked over the area. They were looking over several, as you know, because they wanted water supply, they wanted power, they wanted proximity to trains and workforce, which Knoxville provided.
Okay, that's good. I knew that there was a visit. I did not know when, but I know that that's the time that they actually talked to the Tennessee Valley Authority about the Norris Dam. And you're right, there were other areas that maybe they even visited at that time. I think even one may have been up in Kentucky, but at any rate, there were other sites being considered.
They went all over the United States.
Hmm.
The next picture, you'll see the flag, which is the Army Corps of Engineers, and that's why headquarters was named the Castle, because you see that that figure there. At his hand is not an ashtray, it's a paperweight, and most of your viewers in Oak Ridge will recognize this Ed Westcott photo. At the Castle, he had a 360 view of the Oak Ridge area, and it became the center of wartime atomic energy activity. Of course, he reported directly to Major General Groves, who served as the commanding general of the Manhattan Project. When he wrote his book, The Road to Trinity, he said, "I never had any doubt that Groves had the final responsibility for major decisions. We both traveled extensively to gather our facts directly from the organizations and individuals involved at the work sites. Generally, each of us established his own schedule, but we did meet at least once a week at a place where we had a problem in which either of us thought we should both be involved. At times, a contractor would request that we both meet with him. Our separate visits posed the possibility of conflicting decisions or instructions that bothered some of my area engineers, who were my representatives concerning contract provisions. My instructions to these officers were, Groves is in overall charge of the project. When he tells you to do something, if you are in agreement, do it, and then inform me about it. If you disagree or think I would disagree, call me, and I will tell you how to handle it. I also instructed them that Groves' intervention would be of necessity be intermittent. And when he left the ball in the air, as he frequently did, it was their job to catch it and carry on as usual.
That was good advice, because Groves was really making a lot of decisions about a lot of firsts that had never been done before.
That's right. And this AAA priority gave Groves the equivalent authority as a chief of engineers. So instead of going to the Army chief of engineers, Groves replaced him in authority and actually had more authority than the chief of engineers. and that streamlined everything. The first thing that they approached was the construction of the town of Oak Ridge and the town of Richland in Washington. So he is rightly known as the father of Oak Ridge. I enjoyed reading a interview of June Adamson, who was his neighbor directly next door at 109 Olney Lane. And she recalls he was a very nice man. There's no other way of putting it. He was fair. He was smart. It's because of him that the town is laid out the way it is. If Groves had had his way, and I'm convinced of this, he would have bulldozed down the valley and gotten rid of all the trees, and never mind what kind of houses. He didn't care. Nichols cared. He wanted this to be a real community, and it's thanks to him that it's laid out as it is. I had a lot of admiration for Nichols. Nichols was thoroughly a nice guy who knew what he was doing. She also talked about the secrecy at Oak Ridge, and she said, I didn't pester him too much. I was too much in awe of him. I knew it had something to do with physics, because why would Arthur Compton be here otherwise? Of course, Arthur Holly Compton was directly across the street from them. Even though I was totally in awe of Nichols and Compton, I didn't feel I had to be. They treated me like I was anybody else. In fact, the Nichols used to loan us their car.
How about that? So he was a good neighbor on top of everything else.
Yes, and June would become a babysitter for David and Jan.
So Dave, you were there in Oak Ridge then.
Yes, Jan and I were there. We were, I don't know if it's common knowledge, but we were adopted by Jackie and Nichols. I was born the 31st of December in 1944, and my birth mother died while giving me, producing me. And my father, my birth father, was shot down in the Pacific. And so I was taken over by a grandfather, my paternal grandfather, I guess, who was an Episcopal minister, and he tried to take care of me for a couple months and realized he did not learn how to do that in seminary. And so put me in an adoption agency, and probably in, I don't know, March or April, I was adopted by the Nichols, 1945. And my sister Jan came along several months later. So to me, that's the most loving thing I can think of that my parents did for me, is to bring me into their family. And then when you consider, you know, the last 3 or 4 months before the Enola Gay flew over Hiroshima, they're raising infants. And I guess it was a good distraction for my dad, and certainly probably kept my mother thinking about raising us rather than what was going to be happening in the very near future. But yeah, we were, my sister and I were both truly blessed to have been selected by them to be their children.
Well, that's a tremendous story, and I agree with you. That was a very loving thing for them to do, especially with all the responsibility that that your dad had. And again, I know that his reputation is a good one in Oak Ridge, and rightly so. But you've given us an insight into him that that I did not know, and thank you for that. That
For sure.
That's amazing. Barbara, you ready to move on to the next one?
Sure. Well, actually, as to Oak Ridge,
Okay.
he was overall responsible for Oak Ridge, the construction, the layout,
Yeah.
but he delegated oversight to a town mayor. He was still the final arbiter, but his work in Oak Ridge forced him to deal with local and statewide politics. He wanted to create as normal a town as possible, despite it being a secret city. When he was back in Oak Ridge, the last time he visited there was 1982 for the 40th reunion. He shared the following at his keynote dinner speech. The town of Oak Ridge itself represented about 100 million for construction, or about a tenth of the overall cost of the Clinton Engineer Works. However, more headaches were generated per dollar spent in the construction and operation of the town than for the production plants. Handling personnel on a construction job or an operating plan is one thing, but being responsible for the men, women, and children in a government-owned town, of which the best that can be said for the form of government is that it was a benevolent dictatorship, is another matter. Rowan Anderson, the contractor which had charge of the operation of the town, absorbed most of the criticism, which naturally resulted from building the 5th largest city in Tennessee in a matter of months, furnishing all the facilities from scratch, such as schools, theaters, library, hospital, stores, buses, telephone, recreational facilities, restaurants, churches, houses, and dormitories, for a constantly growing population, was bound to cause periods when the residents' patience wore thin. Also, we had many varied opinions about how to operate the town. One big major thing he had to do was convince state officials that a new road was needed between Oak Ridge and Knoxville. The design, construction, and operation of the nuclear sites producing the weapon-grade plutonium and uranium-235 was his major focus, and that was done on the 90 square miles of the Clinton Engineering Works in Oak Ridge, known as Site X, and the 631 square miles of the Hanford Engineering Works near Pasco, Washington. Oversight of all contract work at 10 other sites that produce feed material located throughout the United States and Canada was under his responsibility. All of this done simultaneously. At Y12, which you're most familiar with, Ray, that was the electromagnetic plant. The K25 plant was known as the gaseous diffusion plant, and that was the biggest in the terms of the biggest secret and the biggest building. It had 44 acres or 2 million square feet. It cost 512 million. Today, that would be about 13 billion. They spent over 200,000 just on the construction before they even purchased special equipment. Uncle Ken was in charge of the overall design and operations, but he worked with all kinds of people. The Kellex Corporation, for one, they were known as a subsidiary of the Kellogg Company, and that's where the K for Kellex came from, and 25 for the U-235 that was produced there. Extreme cleanliness, vacuum tightness. They had to build their own power horse. It had coal-fired boilers that produced 750,000 pounds per hour of heated steam. That was created because they were afraid that the TVA Norris Dam would be unreliable in the event of a power interruption, even for a fractional second. It might take days to power back up. There was 3,000 stages in the K25. It was called a U cascade. 6,000 compressors, 3,000 gas coolers, 3,800 miles of electric conductors, 825 miles of conduit, 90,000 separate electrical system checks, 700 miles of tubing and copper wiring, 350,000 yards of concrete, 38 million board feet of lumber. They had multiple challenges, the biggest being the diffusion barrier, which had not been invented. They had to create all of this. So K-25 was impressive, and it became the sole source of the U-235 for the war. Of course, there was other ones that were built, the S-50 thermal liquid diffusion plant, and that was constructed for 10.5 million, 5 million for operation. And Nichols said after the war, we calculated that the thermal diffusion plant had saved 9 days in providing sufficient material for the uranium bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. The cost of the 10 million construction and 5 million for operation was considered a bargain, because when you look at the daily cost of war and saving a life for even a few days, turned out to be a good investment. The plant S-50, no one wanted to build it. 21 firms turned it down as undoable. The Nazis had a program using thermal diffusion, but they couldn't make it work. The Japanese had a research and they concluded this isn't going to work. But in September of 44, the S-50 came on board, and just 69 days after construction. The Y-12 was the third project. It was started in February of 43, electromagnetic, and that's where the calutrons, designed by Ernest Lawrence, was so famous. And that word calutron came from California University cyclotron that Ernest Lawrence designed. At the peak operating force, there was almost 23,000 people. It was the first of its kind plant. By mid-43, Dr. Oppenheimer had tripled the estimate of the amount of the U-235. That caused a bit of consternation. But it served its purpose, and it closed in December of 46. Uncle Ken made the unpopular decision to close it by year end of 46, which saved the taxpayers $2 million a month without risking uranium production. In making this plant work, there was a shortage of war supplies. They were desperate for copper. But the scientists came up with a solution of substituting silver. 14,700 tons of silver that he procured from the West Point depository of the Treasury. Each month during the war, he had to sign an inventory for the Treasury stating that he still had possession of over 400 million troy ounces of silver. At that time, that was worth $300 million of silver. Today, it's about 5 billion. So that gives you an idea. I know your audience is well aware of those plants, but the magnitude of those, as well as all the other responsibilities he had, was enormous. So, of course, we talked about the procuring of material, the silver. Also is the famous story of obtaining 1,200 tons of the world's highest grade uranium from the Belgian Congo mines of Edgar Senghor. And that was recently featured in a Japanese documentary. And Dave was the one of the ones that was interviewed for that. Also at Oak Ridge, Uncle Ken at the peak was supervising 125,000 people directly and under contractors. He personally chose people for each assignment, and he wrote, he chose people whom I felt had the ability to make decisions and carry them out expeditiously. Once selected, I trusted him to do his job unless he proved deficient. I believe that giving a man such freedom of operation creates an atmosphere in which he will strive to live up to the confidence vested in him and usually achieve more than he ever thought possible. This became even more crucial as we implemented compartmentalization throughout the project to maintain secrecy. He was also in charge of the administration of research at the University of California, the University of Chicago, and Columbia University, as well as 19 other universities. He was in charge of the administration at Los Alamos, but of course, General Groves was headquartered there, and Dr. Oppenheimer reported directly to him there with 4,000 personnel. Uncle Ken handled the $2 billion budget. He accounted to the Comptroller General. And after the war, the Comptroller General reported to Congress that it was the best administered project of the war. He traveled 10,000 miles a month between all the project sites. It wasn't until April of 45 that he had his own B-25. And of course, on Atom Bomb Day, he was the one responsible for coordinating all the press releases to the national and international organizations. He had one room entirely devoted to all the handouts to go out to the newspapermen, and he gave radio and in-person interviews. He was highly respected by the people that worked with him. He worked closely with all the top military officers and scientists. He worked closely with the top executives of the companies working on the project. They respected him because of his character. His personality worked well with other people, and his credentials. The scientists respected him because he had his own PhD. He was known for action and solving problems. He worked with people until the solution was found. He and Groves were famous for making everyone sit in one room until the problem was solved. He and Groves did not travel together because both were irreplaceable in the event of an accident. Nichols was known for keeping up morale and praising people. And one story I thought, Ray, you'd enjoy, you may have read about this, boosting morale. He talked about in the 40th reunion, he said, an incentive for Tennessee Eastman to make schedule. I bet a case of whiskey with Dr. Conklin of Tennessee Eastman that they couldn't meet the schedule they had predicted. I bet the scotch in General Groves' name because I thought they would derive more pleasure in winning the bet with him than with me. I told General Groves I thought he ought to cover at least half the cost. He agreed, and it turned out Tennessee Eastman won, but I did get the enjoyment of sharing some of the scotch, so I was repaid for my half of the bet.
Oh, that's neat. I had not heard that story, but Tennessee Eastman met the schedule. How about that? All right. Well, that's a good recap of enormous responsibility that then Colonel Nichols had in managing, in fact, the daily operations of everything in the Manhattan Project, with the sole exception of Los Alamos, but he had an administrative responsibility there as well. So he was a key individual for Groves in the execution of the Manhattan Project. Are you ready to move on to the next one?
We are.
All right. What is this we're looking at?
Well, not until the war ended did he really breathe a sigh of relief. June Adamson was the neighbor that talked about what happened on the day that the atom bomb dropped. It was a very different story than the picture you see here. He was not in the middle of town celebrating. He was not gloating. He and Aunt Jackie went for a quiet walk. They walked next door, and June was home babysitting and was surprised when she answered the door and saw Jackie and Colonel Nichols. And they asked if Fran Gates was at home. She wasn't. And so they talked for a few minutes, and he quietly said, "I hope this is the end of all war."
Oh. Yeah.
This picture is after the war ends. He was famous for saying the bomb did not win the war, it ended the war. And Colonel Nichols was known for ending the war a year earlier than they thought possible. So his credit of saving millions of lives, Japanese and American, was rightly acknowledged to him. And Jackie is on the left in this photo. You can see the fun clothes she's wearing and the long gloves. I believe it's Fran Gates that's standing behind him, but I'm not sure. I'd love for someone to confirm that. And I don't know the woman who's to his left, who he's autographing something, but he was the man of the hour.
Mm-hmm.
There was a huge award given at the Army Navy E-Day Award in Oak Ridge and Knoxville in September of 45. He was awarded his first Distinguished Service Medal by the Secretary of War, Robert Patterson, and he was given a tremendous ovation from the audience. Everybody liked working with him. He was very popular.
Yeah.
But his acceptance speech was typical of him. He didn't focus on what he did. Everything was about all the people, the 125,000 people that worked under him that made the project a success.
Wow, that's for sure that he was well liked, and it's appropriate that the recognition was given to him. You ready for the next picture?
Yes. Here he is as Major General. He was a very intelligent person. He had a photographic memory. As I told you, he was the youngest cadet at West Point. He was also the youngest Major General in the Army up to that point. When he walked into a room, you took notice. He had a presence about him. He was confident, but he was not arrogant. He was tall and he stood very straight. And Jackie talked about that at West Point when they gave him a distinguished service later in his life. And he stood out on the parade ground in the blazing sun, straight as an arrow, even in his late years. He had a good sense of humor. He could talk with anyone, no matter their level of education or wealth. And he was a great judge of character. He knew how to help people achieve their best. You couldn't ask for a better leader. He loved to read. He was never without books or magazines. And he loved to study military campaigns. He played poker and he was a rifle sharpshooter. So he was an all-around person.
Yes, that's for sure. He sure was. Now, what is this one?
This is a picture in 1982. He's now in private practice as a consultant. This is taken in front of the guest house at Oak Ridge with Aunt Jackie, and they invited him specially for the 40th reunion. He gave the keynote speaker, and he was the celebrity of the hour.
How about that? Well, that's great. That's a great picture of them sitting out on the front of the guest house. And we'll end with this one. This is a photograph that was autographed by Ken Nichols to Ed Westcott. And Ed, of course, made all the black and white photographs that we have of Oak Ridge. And without his photographs, I wouldn't be able to tell the history nearly as well. But he obviously knew then Colonel Nichols. And at this point, you see, he was a brigadier general. So that says that this photo was made after the war and was given to Ed. Well, thank you so much, Barbara, for sharing that information about Nichols and his involvement, his lifelong involvement, if you will, and appreciate that. And obviously at this point, because of the movie, the Oppenheimer movie, we've got lots of attention being brought to the Manhattan Project era, but that movie is about Oppenheimer. It's not so much about the Manhattan Project, other than it does show the Trinity test and talks about the bomb being dropped on Hiroshima. But if you don't know the difference, you don't understand exactly might not understand exactly which bomb it was. But we know that it came from the uranium from Oak Ridge. Oak Ridge is mentioned twice, once as Oak Ridge and once as Tennessee, as they were actually making the decisions to locate these particular sites. Have you all seen the movie Oppenheimer?
I've Lyle and I went to see it a couple of weeks ago. Our daughter was down, and the three of us went, recognizing it was a 3-hour show. Probably broke a record in Hollywood for duration. It was we all thought it was well done. It was informative, a lot of information. Clearly it was about Oppenheimer, thus the title. I think the thing that concerned me the most, if there was anything to walk out of being concerned about, was, does it redefine the Manhattan Project? Are there young people in their 20s and 30s that are seeing that movie and saying, wow, this is, but for Robert J. Oppenheimer and Leslie Groves and, old Mr. Strauss over in the corner, what were the 120 some odd thousand people doing in Oak Ridge where
Dave, we've lost you.
Yeah, he's gone frozen on us there. Maybe he'll come back. He's correct in that there's a lot more to the Manhattan Project story than just Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer did influence Oak Ridge in a couple of major ways. He recommended the thermal diffusion S-50 be built, and he also, by saying that they were going to need more uranium-235 than they thought, he enabled the expansion of Y-12 and also reinforced the need for K-25. And so Dave has dropped off. Maybe he will join us back.
I would like to address the relationship between Nichols and Oppenheimer. Yeah. Despite what Oak Ridgers have been hearing over the last year, the fact is General Nichols enjoyed working with and highly respected Dr. Oppenheimer. He defended Dr. Oppenheimer's loyalty to our country whenever he was asked about the issue. He met Dr. Oppenheimer 3 months before General Groves, and he never hindered the advancement of Dr. Oppenheimer as the Los Alamos scientific director. In fact, Colonel Marshall, General Groves, Colonel Nichols, and Dr. Oppenheimer traveled on the 20th Century Limited train. If you remember the great Hitchcock movie with Cary Grant and Eva Marie Saint, that's the 20th Century Limited. The four of these men squeezed into Nichols' cabin. How in the world they did it, we don't know. And my uncle wrote that the purpose of the trip from Chicago to New York was to interview Dr. Oppenheimer for the specific role in Los Alamos. And my uncle wrote, when Oppenheimer left the train in Buffalo, there remain no doubts in my mind that he should direct the new lab, despite the difficulties we would have in clearing him. There's absolutely no evidence that they did not get along, both in what I understand and what David understands. They respected each other, and they were united on developing the atomic bomb as quickly as possible. After the war, General Nichols worked with Dr. Oppenheimer on the long range objectives panel. He said that he enjoyed working with him. General Nichols described Dr. Oppenheimer as a genius. He called him his friend. After President Eisenhower changed security regulations, General Nichols insisted that Dr. Oppenheimer was loyal to the United States in spite of being a security risk. And he repeated that in his book, as well as interviews and speeches until he died in 2000.
Thank you for that. I think that's an interesting observation to make about the relationship between the two. And I realize that Major General Nichols was put in a difficult position by the Atomic Energy Commission. But as they looked at it, I mean, even General Groves said he wouldn't have cleared him under the present requirements established for clearance. Here comes Dave back.
Oh, good.
And
that is correct. So what most people do not know is that Colonel Nichols signed Oppenheimer's security clearance in 1943. Colonel Nichols was very clear to him that, like anyone else, he would be surveyed. His mail would be opened. Any trips that he took, any telephone calls, as with everyone, they would be monitoring that. It was a tragedy. Uncle Ken on the record said the Oppenheimer hearing ruined a damn good man. And he, what is not brought out is the close relationship they had before and after the war. The day that he met with Dr. Oppenheimer and Louis Strauss, they did not want to have anything to deal with it. The letter from Mr. Borden went directly to J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover met with President Eisenhower. Eisenhower was the one that ordered the wall of separation. Eisenhower was the one that changed the regulations, and executive order was issued, and thousands of people lost their security clearances when Eisenhower took charge. So the night that letter was given to Dr. Oppenheimer, Oppie actually called my uncle that night and said, "What do I do? Should I resign?" And Uncle Ken said, "I can't advise you. You're my friend, but I'm now on the other side of this issue. I have no choice in this." The letter that was signed by Uncle Ken was drafted by a young attorney named Harold Green. Harold Green did not follow orders. My uncle gave him very clear orders that nothing should be mentioned about the hydrogen bomb. And my uncle respected Dr. Oppenheimer's opinions. He said, "You cannot put that as a charge in the letter." And they spent many, many discussions with Harold Green on the days leading up to the drafting of that letter. Harold Green came in on a Sunday afternoon when no one was at the AEC and worked hours and put in a separate paragraph. Then Monday morning, he took it to the commission. The commissioners agreed to the letter without my uncle's knowledge. He again said, "Do not put this paragraph in." And Harold Green and the commissioner said, "We have to put it in. It's about Dr. Oppenheimer's veracity." And my uncle said, no, this is going to be taken out of context. You are going to be saying that he had a difference of opinion, and he was right in having a difference of opinion. That's what science is all about. What happened? Dr. Oppenheimer decided to go forward with a hearing. They did not want that. They were hoping that it would just, he would allow it to expire. They wouldn't renew the contract. That didn't happen. He said, I want the hearing. I want this on the record. And his attorneys released the letter to the New York Times. They changed the one paragraph into 4 paragraphs. They changed the entire meaning. They changed the punctuation. And as we all know, what was the bone of contention? It wasn't that he had communist ties. It wasn't, as we later learned after the war, from Soviet spy master Sudoplatov and other Soviets that have leaked information. We know that he was sharing information with the Soviets. But that was not the hearing. The hearing was he a security risk? Because President Eisenhower ordered that hearing to take place. And J. Edgar Hoover was very intent on dealing with it. So this whole thing about science having an openness and needing to discuss was absolutely correct. And having an opinion was important. And Uncle Ken made that very clear.
Thank you. That is interesting insights that I don't think is generally known about how that situation developed over time, and specifically what Major General Nichols' role was in it and his relationship with Oppenheimer. Dave, is there anything you would want to add? Thank you for coming back. I don't know what happened to the connection. I believe he's frozen again on us, Barbara.
Oh dear. Well, one thing I would like to finish with is his reputation. General Nichols was respected and liked by all that he worked with. General Groves was known to be a different personality. And so a lot of times people would come to my uncle to get things resolved. He also was very respectful of women. He adored his mother. He went out of his way to break his schedule when his sister was dying on her deathbed. He respected the women that worked under him. He called them the Tennessee girls that because of the Tennessee Eastman panels that we also think of as Calyatron girls. He respected the cleaners, the teachers, the nurses, the housewives at Oak Ridge. His secretary, Virginia Olson, was just a delightful person. She understood all the top secret stuff, but he treated her as family, and she attended all the holidays. She never had children or got married, but she was very respected and loved by the family. I remember visiting their farm in Maryland when he retired, and they had a house cleaner named Sarah Taylor who worked with them for many years, and she kept the household running, but Aunt Jackie was a close supervisor. She absolutely adored the general, and in the early morning, she would be alone with him as he was reading or planning his day, and she would make his breakfast. And you could just tell she just adored him the way she looked at him. My mother and he worked on genealogy along with Aunt Jackie, and he really enjoyed going back and looking at his roots. She said he was her favorite uncle, and she remembers as a little girl sitting at a long table at her grandmother's house in Cleveland, and Uncle Ken sitting next to her and showing her how to eat mashed potatoes. Put a lot of butter on it and put a lot of salt. And my mother was just a devoted fan and helped him with his Road to Trinity book. my father and my grandfather, his brother, both died in the 80s, and Uncle Ken just basically filled their shoes. He watched over my mother, invited her down right after their death, and just loved her and supported her. And for me, he was the best. He treated me like a granddaughter. When he kissed you, his mustache would tickle. He also walked me down the aisle on my wedding day, and Jackie said, no, he's not going to wear that uniform. He's going to wear a nice suit, and it's been to the White House several times, so that's good enough for you. And it was a special day, and I will always remember him. He was just the best of best.
Well, listen, thank you so much for taking the time to share with us. And I think Dave has come back again, and I really do appreciate the time. That's okay, not to worry. And Dave, you're back on again. Can you share any closing remarks, anything you'd like to say as we wrap this up?
I'm sorry there's power outage, flickering our lights and power in our building, which obviously got into the computer. I hope you can hear me now, but yes,
yes,
Ray and Barbara as well. The relationship my sister and I had with my father was a loving, caring relationship. As big as he was when we were infants, and also as children and teenagers and people and married people, he always had time for us. We knew that he loved dearly, and we were so proud of him and the way he balanced his family, his career, commitment to his country, the example that he set daily of his loyalty and his love will always be remembered as a special man us, for his family, extended family, and certainly for his country, and we couldn't be more proud.
We were having difficulty hearing you there, but I think I picked up enough to know that you're really proud of the memories that you have of your father and your mother. And thank you so much for agreeing to be on here today and give us some insights. And Barbara especially appreciate what you've been able to share with us.
We thank you, Ray, for the time and the opportunity. I also want to give a shout out to all the wonderful historians and archivists that you have in Oak Ridge. You have a gem of a city. Mike Stallo, Don Honeycutt, and especially you have just been wonderful resources. The beautiful history museum you have there, the library, the Manhattan Project room that Mike is in charge of is just impressive. So thank you. And Quinn Argyle over at ANSI, everyone has just been wonderful. I do have a request. If anybody knows the location of my uncle's stars, badges, and patches, there was a paperweight that he was given at the 1982 40th anniversary. We do not know where those are. Those were a special exhibit on loan to the what used to be the original Atomic Energy Manhattan Project Museum that closed. And I have traced as much as I can. The Army Corps of Engineers has a huge archival program on my uncle with all of his papers that David and his sister Jan have donated, and my uncle over the years. But his stars and badges and different things that were at Oak Ridge are no longer, we don't know where they're at. And we would love to know the location.
I remember seeing that exhibit in the old location of the American Museum of Science and Energy. So rest assured that they did not get destroyed. I'm sure that we can find them, and I will personally talk with Quinn and others and Alan Lowe at the museum, and we will do a search to see if we can't locate those for you. Okay.
We're also curious about the samurai sword that he received from Dr. Warren Stafford. He received one of 3 swords. One went to General Groves, one went to my uncle, and we believe General Groves donated his to a museum. We know that the one that used to be at AMSI was donated by Dr. Stafford's daughter, but we don't know where that is. I suspect that is the one that was ceremonially presented to my uncle, and he probably modestly said thank you very much and gave it back to the doctor.
I see. Okay, I'll add that to my list too, and we'll see if we can help locate those artifacts for you. And
I want
folks,
to do a final shout out to Alyssa Whitley at the Army Corps of Engineers and Bianca Adams. They have been amazing in recategorizing and listing out all the Nichols archives. They're amazing workers.
very good. All right. Thanks again. And folks, we'll be back with you, and Keith will be with me, I'm sure, when we interview our next guest, which is a local filmmaker in the Knoxville area. And we'll show you that in a couple of weeks. Again, Dave and Barbara, thank you so much for being with us today, and really do appreciate it.